In the lower storage rooms of the British Museum, sometime in the early 20th century, the precise date matters less than the shape of what occurred. A cataloguer set a tablet fragment aside. In the intake log, or in something very much like it, 7 words record the decision. Unintelligible, possibly damaged in transit, set aside. What follows that notation is silence. The tablet fragment it described was photographed once, assigned a provisional catalogue number, and moved to a shelf. The photograph was never properly filed. The provisional number leads nowhere in the published catalogues. Whatever the fragment contained, whatever pressed sequence of marks a human hand had committed to clay somewhere between 2,400 and 2,500 years earlier, it crossed into this institution and was immediately, professionally, quietly made to disappear. That is not loss. Loss is disorganized. Loss is flood damage and unmapped excavation sites, and the 1,000 ordinary destructions of time. This was something else. This was a decision written in ink and filed in a drawer, by someone who could read cuneiform and chose not to say what they had read. The accepted story of Mesopotamian scribal culture is tidy. Babylon produced grain tallies, land transfer documents, royal proclamations, astronomical observations. Its scribes were administrators in a civilization of extraordinary organization. They kept records. They copied texts. They maintained a bureaucratic continuity that makes modern record-keeping look impulsive. When the great mythological traditions of Mesopotamia were committed to clay, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, those two were understood as administrative acts. Preservation, canonical repetition, scribes doing what scribes do, keeping the official version intact and transmissible. The system is described in the scholarship as remarkably stable. Scribal families passed their positions down through generations. The same compositions were copied in the same sequence in schools from Nippur to Babylon to Nineveh. A civilization organized around continuity, producing scribes organized around repetition. That is the version. The Igigi, within that official version, are a manageable problem. They appear in Mesopotamian creation mythology as a class of lesser sky gods, divine labourers who rebelled against the Anunnaki, the senior gods, after centuries of working the earth's canals and fields. Their rebellion forced the creation of humanity to take over the toil. In the standard academic reading, this is an origin story for human suffering. The gods grew tired. Humans were made to replace them. The Igigi are background mythology, structurally useful, theologically minor, occasionally cited in footnotes. Nothing in that version demands further inspection. The version is clean, it is well funded, it has textbooks and museum plaques and comprehensive entries written by people who have read the right sources, and it is almost completely uninterested in what specific scribes chose to record in the last years of Babylon's theological independence, which is exactly where the story stops being clean. Here is the first problem. Among the thousands of late Babylonian cuneiform tablets that have been catalogued, there is a documented category that scholars label non-canonical. These are tablets whose content doesn't match any known mythological series. They don't align with the Enuma Elish. They don't fit the Atrahasis. They reference figures, verb forms, and ritual formulas not present in any established liturgical sequence. Scholars have noted this category, flagged it with appropriate uncertainty, and largely moved on. The standard explanation is scribal variation, regional differences, idiosyncratic copying, the ordinary textual noise of any large tradition. But the dates do not support that explanation. Non-canonical tablets do not appear evenly across Babylonian history. They cluster. Scholars who have mapped the surviving record note their increasing frequency in the 5th century BCE, precisely the period following Xerxes I's destruction of Babylon's main temple complex and his removal of the statue of Marduk. That timing is the first fracture in the official story. Xerxes destroyed the Esagila temple complex in 482 BCE, following a Babylonian revolt. He removed the golden statue of Marduk, which was not only a religious object but a legal mechanism. In Babylonian political theology, whoever physically held Marduk held the right to rule Babylon. This was not metaphor, it was protocol. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not destroy the temple. He went to it. He performed the ceremonies. He was handed the hands of Marduk in the formal rite, and thereby acquired legitimate sovereignty in terms that Babylonians recognized. Darius had maintained this arrangement. His administration worked because it preserved the mechanism of Babylonian self-legitimation. Xerxes broke this arrangement entirely. He took the statue. Ancient sources disagree on what exactly followed, but the statue did not return. The ceremony that had transferred legitimate authority from one ruler to the next across centuries was made impossible because the physical object through which it operated no longer existed. This was not religious vandalism in any ordinary sense. This was a targeted dismantling of the specific mechanism through which Babylonian political legitimacy could reconstitute itself. He didn't erase a belief. He removed the instrument that made the belief legally operative. The scribes who produced non-canonical tablets in the decades following 482 BCE were not generating bureaucratic noise. They were working in the immediate aftermath of that removal. Scribes who are simply copying do not produce a sudden spike of non-canonical, unaffiliated material precisely when the institution that sanctioned the canonical versions has been violently decapitated. What changes after Xerxes is not the volume of scribal activity. What changes is its orientation, and that shift has a specific shape. There is a name. Among the late 5th century BCE administrative records of Babylon, names recur that belong to the documented Akur-Zakir scribal family, men holding prebend rights to temple functions that the Persian administration had already hollowed out. A prebend was not simply a salary. It was a property right, hereditary and transferable, bought and sold and passed down through family lines the way land was passed down. One such figure, representative of a type scholars have documented across multiple family lines, can be traced in these economic records: a ritual title without a functioning institution behind it, a lineage still producing tablets for a system that had officially ended. In a prebend record from approximately the mid-5th century BCE, one such scribe held a ritual function connected to a temple complex already partially dismantled under Xerxes, holding, or at least claiming, the right to perform rituals for an institution that no longer had state sanction under Persian imperial governance. His position was a legal artifact of a system that had been officially ended, a title referencing an authority that no longer recognized him. What do you write when your institution has been looted, your ritual object taken, your state religion decapitated, and you still hold a title that no longer connects to any functioning power? The question is not rhetorical. It has an answer, pressed into clay, in the years that follow. This figure was not alone. Scholars tracking the Neo-Babylonian Temple Archive record have documented multiple scribal families across this same period, showing the same pattern. Continued ritual titles, continued tablet production, no institutional affiliation appearing in Persian administrative records, which were themselves thorough and well organized. The Persians documented what they administered. The absence of these families from those documents is not invisibility. It is a particular kind of absence. They were not registered because they were operating outside the system that had replaced the one that trained them. The pattern spans family lines and temple affiliations. It is consistent enough to constitute a practice, not a coincidence. Among the non-canonical material, certain fragments contain a detail that specialists have noted in passing, without pressing its implications. A verb form appears, one that in Babylonian is grammatically reserved for royal commands, the linguistic register of institutional authority, the register in which kings speak from a position of recognized legitimacy. In these fragments, that verb form is applied not to a king, not to a figure in the Anunnaki hierarchy. It is applied to a speaker identified in the context of the Igigi, the labor rebels whom the official mythology had already demoted, replaced by humans, and filed as ancient history. Someone deliberately used the grammar of sovereign command to give operative voice to a figure whose speech the official theology had already ended. In a scribal culture where the grammatical register of a statement was not stylistic but legal and cosmological, where the verb form determined whether a command had binding force or merely descriptive weight, this was not a copying error. This was not regional variation. This was an argument made in grammar. Someone was insisting in the most precise technical language available to them that this figure's authority had not expired, that it predated the institutions that had tried to end it, that it remained operative regardless of what the current administration recognized. The Igigi were being reactivated. The suppressed reading of those non-canonical fragments, the one the standard scholarship does not pursue, is that these scribes were not preserving mythology. They were preserving a counterclaim to legitimacy, a claim to authority older than the Marduk cult, older than the Persian-appointed governance structure, older than any institutional arrangement that could be neutralized by removing a statue. The choice of the Igigi as the vehicle for this counterclaim was not arbitrary. In the deep structure of Mesopotamian cosmology, the Igigi occupied a unique position. They predated the division between divine labour and human servitude. Their rebellion was the hinge point at which the current order came into existence. Any authority they possessed was therefore structurally prior to that order, prior to the state, prior to the institutional religion, prior to any king who had ever held the Marduk statue and claimed what it represented. Now step back. Xerxes did not destroy the Esagila because he was impulsive or irreligious. He destroyed it because the Marduk statue was the mechanism through which Babylonian self-governance could be reconstituted by any future claimant. His destruction was structurally targeted. He removed the specific object that made Babylonian political legitimacy portable and transferable. Without it, no one could perform the ceremony. Without the ceremony, no one could claim the throne in terms Babylonians would recognize as valid. The ceremony was the system. The scribal families writing non-canonical texts in the following decades understood exactly what had been lost and exactly what remained. The Marduk statue was gone. The formal institutional apparatus was gone. But the knowledge that had existed before the Marduk cult, the theological traditions, the Igigi material encoded, the ritual formulas that operated outside the state temple framework, that was still transmissible, still committable to clay, still pressable into the record by a trained hand working under deliberate intention. What those scribes were doing was not piety in the ordinary sense. It was preservation under threat, and the Xerxes family and the others like them were among those doing the preserving. The prebend records of these families tell a particular kind of story at their endings. A name in the record and then nothing after. No death record, no property transfer, no son's name appearing in subsequent documents to inherit the position, as was standard practice in Babylonian scribal families, where continuity of function was both economically important and meticulously documented. Family lines in this tradition do not simply stop. They generate transition paperwork when they end, inheritance disputes, formal lapses of ritual rites, reassignment of prebend shares to other family members. All of this left marks in the archive. Some of these lines stop without those marks. In a record-keeping culture, a clean stop is not natural. A clean stop is the absence of the record that should exist. And an absence, in a culture this thorough, is itself evidence of something. Something was written before that silence. The question is not whether a final tablet existed. The non-canonical production evidence, the family continuities, the grammatical arguments being pressed into clay in exactly those years, all of it points toward final inscriptions from these lineages. The question is what was pressed into them, and why the lines that should have carried it forward went quiet at the same moments that they did. Some silences are accidental. These have the shape of decisions. The Igigi rebellion, as it appears in the canonical texts, is a story about replacement. The lesser gods worked the rivers and the fields. They rebelled. Humans were made to take their place. The story ends there, neatly, with humanity inserted into the cosmic labour system and the Igigi retired into theological background. This is the version that survived in the institutional record. This is the version that was copied in scribal schools, recited in temple ceremonies, and eventually transcribed by European scholars who recognized in it a satisfying structural parallel to Genesis. The rebellion explained why people suffer. The creation of humanity resolved the plot. Everything after that was administration. But in the non-canonical material, scattered across several museum collections in forms that have never received sustained scholarly attention, something recurs, a grammatical construction in which the Igigi are given speech that functions not as description but as declaration. What they declare, in the fragments specialists have noted without developing, appears to involve a name, not the name of a god in the hierarchy, not a character in the rebellion narrative, a name that functions grammatically not as a noun in a story but as a speech act. That name does not appear in the Enuma Elish. It does not appear in the Atrahasis. It is not in any liturgical series that has been canonically identified. It is present only here in the exact material flagged in Western museum catalogues as variant, non-canonical, or, in more than one notable case, unintelligible. In Babylonian ritual theology, this distinction matters enormously. Certain spoken formulas were not descriptive language. They were operative. They did not describe a state of being, they changed it. The specific verb constructions used in ritual incantations, divine proclamations, and legal declarations were understood to carry performative force. The saying of the thing was the doing of the thing, provided the speaker had the recognized authority to say it. This is why the royal verb form in these fragments is not a stylistic curiosity. If the Igigi are given the grammatical register of legitimate command, and if they then speak a name in that register, the implication within Babylonian theological logic is precise. The name, when spoken, does something. It changes a status. It asserts a claim. It draws a boundary around what is and is not within the authority of any power that came after them. The name the Igigi speak is the name of death, not as an invocation of destruction. That reading is the easy one, and it is wrong. In Babylonian cosmological logic, to correctly name death, to speak its boundary condition, to define the limit of what any power can finally do, was not to summon catastrophe, it was to name the edge of authority itself. Any power that could not cross death's boundary was a power with a limit. Any king, any empire, any institutional religion that operated within that limit was implicitly subordinate to whatever stood at the limit's edge. The Igigi in those fragments are not threatening anyone. They are making a structural observation. There is a boundary that no throne can dissolve. And we were here before you built the throne. This is what these scribes were carving into clay in the decades after Xerxes. Not rebellion, not sentiment. A jurisdictional argument encoded in the only language they had left. Now consider who needed that argument suppressed, and when, and for how long. Persian imperial administration was not hostile to religion. Cyrus had famously reversed the policies of Babylon's own kings and allowed deported peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. Persian governance worked through accommodation. It absorbed local theological traditions into a framework that positioned the Persian king as the protected sovereign of every god's people. What it could not absorb was any theological tradition that made an authority claim older than Persian sovereignty itself. The Marduk mechanism had been neutralized, but a formula that predated Marduk, that located legitimate authority not in any statue, any temple, any appointed intermediary, but in a cosmological boundary that existed before the current order, that was something the framework could not contain. It could only starve the people carrying it, and starve them it did. The method was administrative, not violent. Prebend revenues were redirected. Temple positions were allowed to decay without replacement. Younger generations in the scribal families of Babylon were increasingly trained in Aramaic, the imperial administrative language, rather than cuneiform. Cuneiform literacy was not banned. It was simply made economically irrelevant. Within 2 generations, the people who could read these tablets were dying without successors. The knowledge did not need to be destroyed. It only needed to be left without anyone to transmit it. Death by obsolescence, cleaner than persecution, harder to name as a policy, and thoroughly effective. This is where the story opens its second layer, because the same logic that governed Persian suppression of Babylonian counter-theology in the 5th century BCE was running again, in a different language, with different institutional cover, when the great wave of Western archaeological excavation moved through Mesopotamia between roughly 1850 and 1930. The tablets that came out of those excavations were not acquired randomly. They were acquired through a classification and prioritization system built by scholars trained primarily in biblical archaeology, men whose professional framework positioned Babylon as the background to Genesis, as the setting for the Tower of Babel, as the civilization against which Hebrew scripture defined itself. What they were looking for was confirmation, and confirmation was what they funded, excavated, transported, and translated. The flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh caused a sensation in 1872 precisely because it seemed to parallel the story of Noah. The Atrahasis epic was translated because it illuminated the same territory. The Enuma Elish was published because it offered a creation narrative that could be compared to Genesis. Non-canonical tablets offered no such confirmation. They referenced figures, formulas, and cosmological claims that didn't map onto the biblical framework. They didn't explain anything that scholars had already decided needed explaining. They were filed. They were noted in excavation reports as variant or irregular. In some cases, they were simply described as damaged and set aside. Here is the number that changes the scale of this problem. The British Museum currently holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets. Fewer than 30% have been fully translated and published in accessible scholarly editions. The remainder sit in storage, catalogued in some cases, partially catalogued in others, filed under provisional numbers that have not been updated in decades. That is not a resource problem in any simple sense. An institution that can fund global acquisitions, maintain climate-controlled storage, and support generations of curatorial staff is not without resources. That number reflects a prioritization. Across 5 generations of scholarship, the tablets most likely to confirm what scholars already expected to find have been translated. The rest have waited. This is the institutional context in which certain tablets get set aside. The cataloguer who writes the note is not malicious in any individual sense. They are operating inside a framework that has already decided what Babylonian material is worth full attention. A tablet that doesn't fit any known series, that references formulas not present in any canonical text, that appears to give operative speech to figures the institutional mythology has already closed. That is exactly the kind of tablet the framework is not designed to pursue. What the Xerxes scribes pressed into clay in the middle decades of the 5th century BCE passed through 3 overlapping systems of suppression before reaching any shelf in any museum. The first was Persian imperial governance, which starved the scribal families who carried non-canonical knowledge until no one remained to transmit it officially. The second was the collapse of cuneiform literacy itself, a collapse that was not accidental, but the downstream result of administrative decisions that redirected training and revenue away from the tradition. The third was Western Assyriology, which excavated the physical remains of that tradition and then sorted them according to a framework that had no category for what was most dangerous in them. The tablet was not lost to time, it was lost to 3 consecutive institutional decisions that each had reasons, in their moment, to leave it where it was. Put the case together plainly, the Igigi rebellion narrative in its non-canonical form was a cosmological argument that legitimate authority had a boundary, that there existed a limit beyond which no imperial claim, no state religion, no appointed intermediary could extend itself. The Babylonian scribal families who preserved this material in the decades after Xerxes were not producing mysticism. They were preserving the only counterclaim to Persian sovereignty that could not be neutralized by confiscating a statue, because it was not located in any statue. It was located in the structure of the cosmos as they understood it, and they pressed that understanding into clay in the most precise technical language available to them, before their lines went silent. The last practitioners of a suppressed tradition do not typically fight. They encode. Across collapsed civilizations and dismantled systems of knowledge, the pattern recurs. The thing that cannot survive in open institutional form is compressed into the artifact stream. A tablet, a marginal gloss, a naming practice preserved in a village long after the theology behind it has been officially ended, a formula maintained in ritual context long after its original meaning has been declared inadmissible. What survives is almost always the institutional version, because institutions have storage and funding and cataloguing systems and interested inheritors. What gets lost is whatever challenged the institution at its root. The 130,000 untranslated tablets in the British Museum are not an accident of time. They are the accumulated sediment of a prioritization system that has been running, under different names and different institutional frameworks, for approximately 2,500 years. What that system prioritizes is the version of the past that confirms the authority of whoever is currently doing the confirming. What it leaves in storage is the version that named the limit of any such authority. Return now to the lower storage rooms of the British Museum, to the early 20th century, to the moment when a particular kind of tablet arrived and a particular kind of decision was made. A cataloguer with training in cuneiform script looks at a fragment and writes a few words. The handwriting is deliberate. The categories used, unintelligible, possibly damaged, set aside, are professional, measured, the language of institutional procedure. The photograph taken of the fragment is filed somewhere it will not easily be found. The provisional catalogue number leads nowhere in the published record. The tablet was not damaged. A trained reader calling a legible tablet unintelligible is not making an error of competence, it is making a decision. what the last scribes of the Exagila tradition pressed into clay under deliberate pressure, in deliberate sequence, in the final years of their documentation, the last records of their living presence in any recoverable archive, was not mythology in any sense that word usually implies. It was a record that a particular kind of authority had existed, had been given voice by figures older than any king, had been entrusted to a family of scribes who understood exactly what the Persian administration intended for them, and had been committed to clay precisely because clay outlasts empires. It was a boundary statement, a record that some things stood before the current order and would stand after it, a record that the limit of what power can finally do had been named, spoken aloud, correctly, by someone who understood the grammar of that naming, and placed in the artifact stream in the faint and deliberate hope that something would survive. The tablet was not lost forever. It was set aside. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between those two phrases, the gap between accidental loss and institutional decision, between the destruction that time does and the destruction that people choose, is not a footnote to this story. It is the story. It has always been the story. We have simply been given a version that made it easier not to see that.